Tom, welcome to For What It's Earth. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
We thought it'd be nice to set the scene a little bit with dairy, as this episode is all about dairy. And maybe it would be great if you could talk us through the process of how do we get dairy from cow to carton? What are the steps?
Okay, it's a long and complex story and a really interestingly long and complex history.
Okay.
And we would say that everything starts with the soil. Other people might start at the beginning of the manufacturing process, but we kind of go back a couple of steps from there.
It's not even cow, it's soil. Soil's
Everything
carton.
starts with the soil. The soil underpins everything that we do. So, plants and soils interact, capture sunlight, turn it into energy and protein, and provide the nutrition for our cows, who are the kind of amazing miracles of nature, who can turn indigestible plant fiber into really nutritious milk and meat. So we go back to the soil. We look at soil health, soil ecology, and what's going on within the soil and the landscape as the first step. We then think about what we're going to grow and how we're trying to manage that landscape and that soil to deliver all the many things we want. Primarily, that's nutrient-dense food, but increasingly, we'll probably come on to, it's asking for lots of buzzwords, nature-based solutions and natural capital improvements and public goods and all of those kind of things. And then we have the cow doing her amazing job, and there's lots of different ways that people kind of set systems up to do that, and we very much focus on grass-based and organic and low-input systems to produce milk. That happens on a daily basis, so in terms of management and considerations that our farmers have to make, all the jobs they have to do, all of the decisions they have to make have to revolve around the fact that they have to milk the cows every day of the year. Christmas Day, your birthday, the days when you're feeling awful, the days when you're feeling great. Unlike some other bits of agriculture, other sectors where they might have crazy busy times of the year and then slightly slower times of the year. So milk's a very kind of short shelf life product that we have to deal with very quickly and on a daily basis, and we can't turn it off. We can't say we don't want any milk or we want a bit less milk.
Not today,
week.
ladies. See you tomorrow.
Which is, for the industry and for the food system is an important consideration, because if we make decisions like, well, we'll get rid of a load of dairy cows, well, we lose something then that's probably impossible to get back, or would be very difficult to get back. It's not a turn it on and off type commodity.
So we've gone through that whole process then. At what points, along that journey, are you focusing on trying to make that whole system more environmentally friendly, like organic and all those different bits of good work that you're doing?
Well, I think, again, it's over the last few years, the strategy there is focused on going back to the soil as the starting point, because not only is that the basis for our production, but it's the basis for most of the impact that we have as well. And the potential area of interest for us to kind of turn on its head lots of the kind of challenges that dairy and livestock get, because soil holds huge amounts of carbon, it cycles water and nutrient through the landscape. We're going to need it in going forwards, whatever type of food we decide to eat. I believe there's one small school of thought that we might magic food out of thin air in bioreactors.
I'm not interested in that future, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, no. Again, it's
Not
about is it possible? Maybe. Does anybody want it?
No.
Probably not. So we're working a lot with farmers and kind of researchers on going back to soil and thinking about how does our farming practice impact there, because in general what we experience is if we kind of make that a management priority, if we think how's soil a KPI for us, then anything that we change seems to have not just an impact on, say, soil carbon or the nutrition of the cows, but on everything else as well, on nature, on people, on the health and nutrition of the food that we produce. So we've been thinking a lot about how our farming policies, our farming standards and approaches go right back to that, to soil as a starting point, and then a holistic approach across all the kind of impact areas that we're interested in. And organic kind of fits very nicely within that, because organic's been doing a lot of that stuff for round about 100 years now, and they weren't necessarily talking about it in the same terms. They weren't necessarily thinking about climate change in the 1940s. But lots of what they've done, we now kind of see meshes really nicely with the types of farming practices that we want to do more of.
I think it'd be really useful to hear from your perspective what you define as organic, or what are the steps that feed the certification to become an organic farm? Because I think a lot of people assume it's just abandoning chemical use.
Yeah.
But I think it's so much more than that here at Yeo or any organic farm.
It is so much more than that. And I think one of the things that probably in organics we've not done really well is describe how much more it does than just the legal standard. The kind of there's a checklist of things you must not do or must do, things you shouldn't use. You know, top of the tree often is synthetic inputs, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and medicine use, hormones, antibiotics, those kind of things. They're all largely out of organics. But what that kind of fails to really capture is what was actually, if you go back to the beginning and you read the books about organic, what they were really interested in and passionate about was the kind of soil as a living system, natural cycles of nature, working with those things, closed systems without not just not wanting inputs because they might have negative impacts down the line, but because you want a closed, self-sustaining loop. So lots of what's regulated as organic is about the size of a hen house or the amount of space animals have to move around, the use of chemistry and medicines. But increasingly we are thinking, well, how do we work with farms to measure some of the good that we know has happened in organic farming systems over many years? You know, organic has been around for quite a long time. It's not perfect, there's development to do, but actually when we say, well, what are the tools we have out of the box, organic's kind of proven, it's been there in the background. If we've wanted to do more of it tomorrow, we know how to do it. So we're trying to focus much more now on measuring the positive outcomes, which is frustratingly much more difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. We kind of understand why people focused on the tick list back in the last, 50 years, of being able to definitely say, well, we know we've audited a farm and we know they don't use this product. That's much, much easier than being able to go and say, well, we've been on this farm, we've extracted soils and put them through a laboratory and we know how much carbon's stored there. That's a very difficult, expensive thing to do. That's where we're moving to, because we want to have that much better data verification, that not just we're not using the negative stuff, but we're delivering the positive stuff, because I think that's where we've really fallen behind, and some of the challenge that we get, not just in organic, but in, I guess, the less intensive end of livestock agriculture, that we've only counted half of the picture, really. We've counted lots of the negatives, and in natural systems there's always a flux of stuff going in and out and up and down, and we've not focused enough on the positives and gathered the evidence to support that. And that's something that we're really keen to work with, not just to show, perhaps government or retailers or consumers, but also to support the farmers and say, well, we've been doing this thing, we've been growing this diverse species mix for a couple of years. What happened? Did it deliver on what we thought, or do we need to iterate again and innovate and go forwards? There's still plenty to improve, but we've probably not done enough of just saying, well, there's loads of good stuff delivered on organic farms over the last 50, 100 years.
And again, you're using, in those instances, are you looking at the soil to tell you those answers?
Soil is probably our starting point, but it's becoming much broader than that. So we look at animal welfare indicators. We look at lots around soil. We look at how farmers are doing, how it's impacting communities. We are getting very interested in the impact of those foods on people's health kind of down the chain. But also there's a massive kind of movement at the moment to try and understand impact on nature, which is a very, how do you measure nature? How do you measure biodiversity is the kind of multi-million dollar question at the moment.
So how do you measure nature and biodiversity?
Straight to it.
Here.
Well, you might have some answers for me.
Benchmarks? Yeah.
It's definitely not buttoned up yet. I mean, we're getting lots of people coming to us and asking us, what are you doing about it? I think you can start in the traditional sense, in the way we've looked at on-farm biodiversity, is to look at the habitats that are on-farm and say, do we think they're that there's much there that's delivering for nature, or is it mostly dedicated to production? And of course, we have production systems globally which have a massive range from being almost in certain parts of the world ecologically dead, and the farming and food production is happening very much in a kind of input-output basis, to farms which deliver kind of regen, agroecological outcomes where it could be quite large parts of the farm are dedicated to natural habitats, or the really exciting and interesting bit is where we're delivering nature and food in the same place, which is kind of the space we're really keen to work in. And I think that's a lot of what organic farms have done, again, without it having necessarily been their target, but because they have to produce their crops and their yields from natural resources, they have to work with nature, because otherwise they just don't get any output. But it's a big question mark at the moment of, well, what are the verification points for this? What do we measure? There's some really interesting moves around AI and how you can place little microphones out in the landscape and they can listen to bird song and play it through an AI module and then tell you what it's heard.
That's cool.
So it's really
That's
cool,
very
isn't
cool.
it? It's amazing technology. It's not quite ready yet to go out on every farm on a kind of rainy day and have a farmer, try and use it. But that, it's leading into that level of development. So we could get from what we traditionally have as a habitat knowledge of farms, which is, limited in really what it tells you in terms of how well what you're doing is kind of thriving, delivering ecological function, to if we can move using tech and a bit more smart observation and stuff, actually knowing more about species, we can get better indicators of, what we're doing helped, or we might need to do less of certain actions. Because things like birds and bats and insects move around much more quickly than floral habitats do. And so if you mess things up, they move out. And if you're doing a really good job, they quite often find it quite quickly and come back into a space. And being able to see that happening would be really valuable. Measuring nature is a bit of a focus at the moment. There's some big international Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures is a big kind of global push to get supply chains to think about their nature impact. So lots of supply chains, very, very big beasts, are starting to think, we don't have the first idea, actually. We have, frankly, pitiful data about nature across most of the farmed landscape. We have some really intensive data on nature reserves and places where people are doing lots of intensive observation, but we have really poor data on what's across the farmed landscape, and that's what we need to get to both know where we are and inform future management. So it's an interesting time if you're into data.
Yeah, thanks for letting me take you down a bit of a monitoring rabbit hole there.
Well, with nature in mind then, we're told all the time across the media that reducing our dairy consumption will reduce our carbon footprint and is one of the most sort of achievable and impactful ways in which we can do something for nature. What's your response here at Yeo to that conversation, and how do you navigate those potential pressures on your industry?
Well, I think the first thing that we always try and describe in this space, because we do get this challenge a lot, is that there's no short, snappy answers to what you should or shouldn't eat, or whether dairy is good or bad, or any other food group is good or bad, because the devil's really in the detail. And that's often what we're trying to do, is bring people here and talk about our dairy, which could be very, very different to global dairy. There are unbelievably different statistics for things like carbon footprint. If you take dairy that's produced in very hot climates where feed has to be shipped into the cows never go outside, to southwest UK or the Low Countries of Europe, where it's a completely different context. So what we try and always describe is, it's not the dairy, it's the how is that dairy being done. It's not the cow, it's the how. Is the strap line.
That's yet another good T-shirt coming off you. Yeah,
we need that T-shirt.
Yeah,
actually.
we do.
And then we try and quickly lead on to, and here's how we do it. Producing dairy from grass-based systems, from organic systems, whilst I've mentioned that we have frustrations about not having enough data, we do have good kind of general data that says on organic farms there's 50% more biodiversity. We've done testing that says there's about 20% more carbon stored in the soil on organic dairy farms. So there's vast differences between different systems, and we believe that the dairy farmers we work with, are and can deliver loads of positive impact, both for climate and for nature. And we're committed to doing that with them. It's not a finished job. It's an ongoing process of continuous improvement. But there's loads of good stuff that's happened, and we want to shine a light on that and encourage those farms not to just flip out altogether and disappear from dairy, similarly to consumers actually, but to look at the dairy that's doing it well. That's a much more powerful thing, I think, to find the people who are producing whichever food you want to eat as well as they can, rather than just remove yourself from that market altogether. I think it's much more powerful to support the good than to just move off and eat something else. And we all have to eat something, right? So I think, again, having looked at lots of different farming systems all over the place, there are always externalities, there are always impacts, and I think we focus on certain ones much more than we probably should, because we need to eat something, and we should be working towards what's the best system we can deliver. Because I think when you move massively into certain commodities, avocado is the one that springs to mind. I don't want to just focus on avocado, but suddenly a huge global market for avocado develops, and that has loads of kickbacks and things that happen there. And we know that dairy and meat is incredibly nutritious and good for us, and therefore if we can deliver that in a way that has co-benefits for environment and climate, and that's what I feel we should be working out. It's what we are working on. And then had we that consumer here, we could take the time to show them around the farms and talk about some of the detail of that, which I think you guys are gonna do, perhaps with William.
Oh yeah,
something we're
See
very
some cows.
excited to be doing. I can tell you that. Sticking potentially with almost not the awkward conversations, but something perhaps that comes up when we're talking about what we do here is plastic, and that conversation around packaging. I know you've done a lot of work to try and reduce how much plastic packaging you use and things like that, but I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the other side of the supply chain, leave soil behind momentarily, and some of your work to make sure that the kind of end products that you're creating are also environmentally and climate conscious. Yeah.
So this is less my area, so I'm happy to kind of discuss what I know. I think, again, for me, it's really interesting what people are interested in. Plastic in the right place is quite valuable to the food system, particularly when you have very nutrient dense and available foods tend to have very short shelf life, so you have to treat them quite carefully. And plastic, for all its faults, does an amazing job of delivering fresh dairy to people in really good condition. And like you say, we've done a huge amount of work removing plastics that as much as we can, while still delivering that kind of protected product. And that's an ongoing process. And one of the big opportunities that's come along. So I think going back in time, we reduced a lot of weight out of packaging, and used the cardboard sleeves that people might recognise around the product. So the plastic isn't holding the pot up; it's providing that kind of barrier to anything getting in, and the cardboard is doing the job of holding the pot in shape. That allows you to remove weight. The next step after that is increasing the amount of recycled material, which is coming back around in cycle in the plastic supply chain. And that is a process of really intense technical development, recovering plastic and using it again. The markets have to wait for their demand to develop those things. So we've always been at the forefront of kind of embracing those developments as they come, and I think they've had great success in the last few years of increasing the amount of plastic recycled content. But it's an ongoing thing. I think it's just always important to say that without the plastic, we might have way more food waste, or we might have food that doesn't get to people in the kind of healthy, natural way that we want it to. And I think there's other supply chains where plastic perhaps isn't such a vital part of delivering the product. But I think some, fresh meat and dairy and fish and things, if it's justified anywhere, it's probably playing an important role there, at least until development brings us something better that we might use.
I want to talk a bit about climate change. We have just, I guess, left we've had the driest spring in 100 years, one of the sunniest springs in 100 years. How is climate change affecting your dairy processes here, and what changes have you observed or perhaps measured since you've been farming here?
I think it certainly feels like a bedding in of uncertainty. The more extreme seasons, more things happening in a way that we might not expect them to traditionally happen in southwest UK, seems to be the order of the day. It's been an interesting spring because for our dairy farmers, it's actually been quite a favourable spring. Lots of people are breathing a bit of a sigh of relief at the moment. We've just had quite a good bit of rain in the West Country, which we desperately needed. If we had gone on another couple of weeks with the dry, we might have been really stuck. But actually for farms who were calving, who were turning cows out to spring grass, who were putting in spring crops, it's been a pretty favourable season. And now we've had a bit of rain that will help everything grow on again.
Is that just because the sunshine helped?
Sunshine helps, sugar's in the grass.
Right.
When it's dry, it's nice to be outdoors working, and calves are born. If the weather's good and the temperature's warm, that helps them. I think the interesting thing is if you look back over a couple of years, even the last 5 years, the amount of extreme seasons we've seen is, for one, they could be very cold and very wet, or they could be very dry and very hot. And this one just seems to have aligned with what dairy farmers quite like at this time of year. Last spring was atrocious, and people are still kind of scarred by it because we just had cold and wet that went on and on and on and on, which is the opposite of what we want. But for other parts of the industry, for people who are growing cereal crops, it was a much more tricky spring because they were trying to establish crops and they needed the moisture to come sooner. So I think what we're bedding into is a much more wild time, basically, not in a good way. And occasionally it will work for you, as it has this time, but most of the time it creates challenges because it's uncertainty. It's building uncertainty into the way we have to kind of manage.
You've mentioned before that off air that being an organic farm adds a level of resilience against that uncertainty. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because that was really something I'd never really considered.
It comes back to that piece of, because the organic guys have not used some of the tools that were in the box in the last century to help farming have a leg up or increase yields or decrease the impact of, pests and disease and those kinds of things. They've had to develop farming systems which just cope a bit more readily. And one of the key principles of that is, it's one of the fundamentals of regen farming as well, is this idea about diversity and increasing the diversity of what you do. And often we think that might mean, you go from growing one crop to two crops in the same place, or 3 crops or 15 crops. But actually you can look at diversity across your whole farm and landscape, and you can say, well, if you go back in time, we might have been growing grass in one field and wheat in another. So we had a landscape diversity of 2 things. Well, now we've increased the diversity of the grass, but we also don't just grow wheat, we grow peas, oats and barley, plus another field has something else going on, and another field. So you very quickly multiply the diversity of what's going on across the landscape. It kind of much more than just increasing the number of crops that you grow on a single square metre. And I think that diversity of stuff just means that you're less likely to get caught out by the season. If you just grow wheat and you have a bad season for wheat, you're kind of at a complete loss. Whereas if you put in loads of different crops, and we really see this as a kind of synergistic thing that happens. I could link through to your book there probably, if I really thought about it. But there seems to be synergies that happen when you grow stuff together. That means if one of the species within a mixture isn't happy, the others can fill in. If you grow peas, oats and barley, and the barley is not liking having a wet time, then
Another
Like most
great
of us.
T-shirt.
then the oats and the peas will use the available space, fill in, and you just reduce your likelihood of having a complete loss. And organic farmers are, it's certainly not exclusive to organic anymore. Loads of farms who are thinking about, how do I build in resilience? How do I do better for my soils and my nature and everything? Are looking at these ideas. Again, it's just one of those things that organic farms have done for quite a long time because they had to build that in at the beginning. They didn't have a pesticide or a fertilizer or a treatment to overcome some of those issues.
So it's forced you to be quite creative, I'm hearing, with your
There's
solutions.
loads of creativity. And, sometimes stuff starts off as an interesting experiment, but it's all coming into much sharper focus now that we are feeling the climate changing. We grew soya on our farm 3 years ago, as a trial. There was not a lot of soya grown in the West Country on dairy farms, I can tell you. And it kind of worked. It didn't really work, but it's getting, the boundaries of crops are moving away from the equator. And we may be thinking more about, well, what are we experimenting with next? What's the new diversity?
So that was
we
a
need
kind
to
of
bring?
planning ahead measure of just
It was,
would this
yeah.
work?
It was, what might work. Often these things can work on it might work in the east of England now, and not get to the West Country for another few years. It seems awful to be discussing things in that kind of lens, but
that's the
we are
reality you're
thinking
facing.
exactly. Resilience is about building in adaptability and then thinking about what we're going to be doing going forwards.
So what does the future look like, do you think, for dairy farming? Beyond Yeo, but here in the UK?
That's a huge question. We certainly think it's continuing down this road of working with farms to increase the built-in resilience in loads of different ways, relying less on things which have to be imported in from great distances to feed cows. We do very little of that in organic farming, but for the wider industry, I think there's thinking going on about how do we, we've perhaps gone to the global markets for commodities because it's been an easy thing to do, and that's not going to be so easy to do in the future. And if we have a real focus on sustainability, we might not want to do that anyway. The use of inputs, energy prices are very directly linked to fertilizer use and things like that. So that's probably going to become more and more difficult to keep using in the non-organic part of the industry. So I think there's the exciting thing about the time we're having at the moment in farming and in livestock and in dairy is that there's so many different ideas and creative things happening for what we might do. There's a whole load of uncertainty about when people make change, when they take on the risk of trying something new. But I think a continuing kind of focus on reducing reliance on external supply chains, closing loops. Perenniality is a really important kind of concept, growing from grass rather than from perhaps annual crops or things like that. That's the great benefit that the livestock or ruminant livestock has, is being able to utilise stuff which we can't readily digest. And I think probably there'll be a move back to doing that kind of thing.
You've mentioned a few times working with other farmers. How does that manifest, and what does that look like when you're working with another farm, and what might be the benefits of that community?
So we work with lots of other farmers in our network. It might not always be apparent, but Yeo Valley now has of a size that we work with perhaps up to 100 organic dairy farmers.
In the West Country? Or all over?
All over the UK. The organic market is not so large that you can totally we have to go where farmers are to a certain extent. We try and focus on the West Country. But we are having done quite a bit of project work. Started on our farms and then worked with 25 organic farms, looking at all the stuff we've talked about, soils, biodiversity, what we're going to have to do in the future. We kind of realised that the way that supply chains have worked in the past, which, post-war has been quite fast-paced, quite what they kind of call it nimble. People move around, and from one year to the next, you might be working with different farms. That might not work going forwards, because if you want to have long-term relationships and gather data and put projects in place to change something, change what you feed your cows, change the type of species you're trying to support in terms of biodiversity, that needs a real long-term approach to both, get the farmers together, encourage them, support them, start changing practice, and then seeing what happens, which can take many, many years. You have to kind of change the way supply chains work. So we're now forming new farmer groups where farmers come in, join our groups, enter into a framework where there's much more back and forth between us and the farms, so that when we are sampling soils, we're not just kind of getting an answer, but we have an ability to have a discussion with the farms, say, okay, so what are we going to do about this? This was really good. What did you do? Tell us what you did. Well, we can tell the other farms. Or, we're all using a feed that we might want to use less of. So let's do that together. How do we find the alternatives? So what we've found is that we have to create much more community. That gives us that kind of long-term ability to work together. But it's also really been a profound kind of driver for why people might want to join one of our groups. It's much more than I kind of probably imagined at the beginning. We started this process perhaps 2.5 years ago. People want to join into our groups because of that community, not just because we might pay them for doing a certain practice, or we might engage with them and put experts on the farm to talk to them about a certain thing, carbon footprinting, whatever. But they want to be within that community and share, not just with us, but with the other farmers who are in there, on what works and what doesn't, and whether what we're doing is kind of going in the right direction. It's been quite profound, and we probably should have known that was the case. But when you sit in it and you sit in the room with farmers and they kind of talk about that stuff, it's really an exciting part of the whole sustainability piece.
I imagine if you're faced with all these different challenges coming from every direction, most of you are just head down cracking on with it, with not much time to come up for air and actually share knowledge and meet other people and sort of share the highs and lows of it all. So it must be quite offloading for them to have
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. I think that's a huge part of that appeal of joining the group, is to some extent, just for many farms, having a reason to get off their farm and go and see somebody else's. At certain times of the year, farms can get very bogged down within just the day-to-day management of their own businesses. And, I might want to work with my farmers to put a particular expert up for them to talk about. But the most valuable thing they might get out of that day is just having gone somewhere else and had lunch with a bunch of people who are working on the same challenges as them, and bouncing ideas around. The whole way that it, group type projects are delivered is becoming a really interesting part of agricultural transition, sustainability, and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, you don't have to sell us on that. We're very excited to be on our own sort of field trip today, out and about. What can sort of the consumer community do to support farmers such as yourselves and other farmers who are wanting to transition to organic or new to organic? Like, what can we as the average yoghurt eater do?
Well, we're above average yoghurt eaters.
Okay, what can we as mass yoghurt consumers,
beyond just eating Yeo Valley, which is obviously a great thing to do. I know how difficult it is walking around the supermarket and making those choices. And I spend an awful lot of time thinking about how, I know about my industry, and I know or feel that lots of people make some wrong judgments or have some of the facts wrong. And I know that's probably the case for me about other parts of the industry, which I know less about. But I think in general, seeking products or people who are even talking about this stuff kind of helps send that market signal. Farmers, supermarkets, us, everybody needs support. We can come up with great projects and great trials, and we can set sail with farmer groups, but we need the consumers at the end of the day to pick the stuff off the shelf. So I think organic is a great place to start. I know that in some respects, organic kind of gets this kind of premiumization. It very much depends where you are and what product you're looking at. In dairy, organic is much more closely pegged to the rest of the market than in some other sectors. But organic is a label that's legally recognised that, as I was saying, does a lot more than just we don't use this and we don't do that. It creates farming systems where people have to work with nature, where there's more diversity and rotation, and where people have been working with soil for a very long time, even if they weren't talking about soil carbon. So organic's a great place to start. Beyond that, there's some really interesting regen stuff starting to happen. It's kind of the rock and roll kid of the food sector at the moment. And there's a lot of kind of head scratching about whether because that doesn't have a legal definition, about whether it's kind of who can say it and who can't, and what marketing claims can be made. And, that the whole greenwash thing is a massive area for us all to be very open-eyed about. But equally, I think there is loads of good work and exciting stuff happening out there. And if you can kind of pick that up in whatever you're kind of thinking about, I think it's quite likely that you're supporting down the chain someone who's thinking about transitioning to doing things differently. And I think for farmers, but for needing the market to support them, you can't really just turn your farm into something else if you haven't got anywhere to send the stuff. But the regen ag and sustainability movement has probably been much more of a kind of sweeping of the industry than it yet has with the consumers, because I think farmers have felt blame, and we all kind of suffer eco-anxiety, but farmers kind of get it doubly because they also feel like they're being made the culprit at times. And so when we or others come forward and say, well, hold on, there's loads of stuff we can measure, and to say, actually, there was good stuff happening which hasn't been recognised, and there's loads of development we can do, there's loads of innovation we can make and do things better still, it totally flips the conversation. It makes you feel like you can be part of a solution, and that's very galvanising and very kind of exciting. And we were talking about groundswell briefly. There's a festival. It's become a festival. It started off as a kind of agricultural show of machinery. It's now become a festival, and it just has the most amazing feel to it, because there's this excitement and there's this optimism in this area of farming at the moment. And we kind of have to work out as marketeers and food producers, how do we bring that down the chain and get consumers kind of responding to it, which is a very difficult thing to do. But for farmers, it's already happening. I feel there's a big kind of bottom-up movement, and it's why we find the willingness of people who want to do things a bit differently join our groups on the farmer side. But there's a kind of meeting in the middle to happen between wider society and the farmers here trying to do this stuff.
Do you feel supported from the top? Like, do you feel like there's enough of a conversation, a positive conversation between, or a productive conversation between the farming community and policymakers?
I don't want to be too critical here, because I think policymakers have a difficult time. There's massive global kind of geopolitical stuff happening. There's been COVID and cost of living. But I think it's very difficult at the moment for farmers to feel confidence that they know what's being asked of them for a start. We kind of know what we want. That might not align with other parts of the industry, other commodities, other areas. I think I mentioned it before, but if we want to deliver any of the stuff that we, and I say we, not just as Yeo Valley, but I think as society, of people who are interested in sustainability, and we have to have a long-term approach. None of this stuff flips overnight. We have to support farmers to do things differently if we want them to deliver, food and positive impact. And I don't think at the moment policy is really supporting long-term thinking. I think people are very reactive to what's available. We recently had kind of a major part of farm support payments kind of pulled out from underneath us like a rug pull. And that payment regime wasn't perfect, but people were engaging with it. And now some people are extremely disillusioned with it and frustrated, and we don't quite know what's going to happen after the next kind of the funding review and the next allocation of money to agriculture. So I think I definitely don't envy the policymakers, and I do try and feed in at times what we're doing and what we think works. I understand making that into a broad policy is a very difficult thing to do, but I think we have to try and take a long-term approach, and it has to be joined up from health, human health, down through food, into the farming and the environment, conservation, restoration, and all that kind of stuff. It has to be done together, and it has to be done long-term. And I don't think that anybody really at the moment feels that that is supporting their plans or happening. So that's kind of where I am. We need to perhaps take imperfect systems, and rather than changing them wholesale every few years, which means nobody knows if they're coming or going, develop them a little bit more slowly and steadily, and help with the long-term approach.
So that would be your headline if you had all policymakers in a room just for one afternoon. That's the message you'd want them to go home with, is help us think long term.
Yeah, I know there's often a desire for kind of headline grabbing stuff, and overnight successes and silver bullets. And I don't think that those things really are part of what makes that food system of the future. I think it is going to be, change happens relatively slowly in agriculture and incrementally, and we need to give people the breathing room and the headspace to work towards that, make the changes, the investments, the decisions, take on the risks. Long-term thinking is my key message to policymakers, how they might incorporate that.
So
I'm sure they all listen to Ford It's Earth, so
of course they do. Well, I'm sure. I guess like it's bringing you out of that survival mindset, isn't it, and giving you, as you say, a bit of breathing space to actually plan.
I think there's been and continues to be a real survival mindset, and frankly, some people are not surviving. Farms are going out of business daily, and I think that's very difficult. If you want to ask anyone to do anything differently, you have to give them that, the reassurance that they're going to be here, running their business in a year's time. You've got to be, you've got to have a kind of sure economic footing to be able to think and look up and think about what the next thing is.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. In that case, one last question for you. We didn't tell you this was coming, but you have assured us that you listen to the podcast, so maybe it won't be a surprise. We ask ourselves every episode, and I'm afraid we ask everyone we speak to, what one good thing have you done for the planet this week? And just running an organic business doesn't count.
That's quite a good thing. True.
Because we can't compete with that.
Don't say that. All of the great things you just listed don't count.
No.
I went to Open Farm Sunday yesterday.
Ooh,
and helped to farm a really fantastic farm in our network, to run a day where they had 1,400 members of the public come through their farm. So perhaps it's a slightly different answer to kind of what thing did I pick off the shelf and use or consume. But I do think, in everything that I've just been talking to you about, a bit more understanding of agriculture and the challenges and the realities, really helps people to inspect those kind of, should I just eat this thing or not? Should I flip out of meat or dairy or whatever? Really helps inform people's thinking. Absolutely, we're lucky we bring lots of people through our farms here. Absolutely encourage people to get close to anything they can to make their decisions a bit more in depth than the split second, do I like the packaging or whatever that they're making in the supermarket. So I think maybe a good thing I did this week was helping on that farm shepherd thousands of people so they could see cows being milked and grass growing and compost being made and soil being looked after. You've just missed Open Farm Sunday for this year, but it happens every year.
Okay, because I was going to say, is there there might be listeners listening who feel very curious about Yeo Valley and might want to come see it for themselves. Is there any way that they can do that?
Yes, well, encouraging people to get out on any farm they can, but, people can come to our farms. We run throughout the year days called Farm to Fridge, or Best of Both, which is best of both farming and cooking, I think. So if you're a bit foodie like I am, that might be the one to do. And occasionally I run the farm to fridge tours. So, if you're really lucky, you'd get on one of those.
Well, let us know those dates.
But
Tom in the flesh.
And we have a garden festival that we're running. So gardening is something lots of people are passionate about. And I often reflect that whilst I'm not a particular gardener, my wife is the gardener in our household, there's this cohort of people out there who kind of get soil and growing because they're passionate about gardening. It's a very British thing to do.
Lighting up.
So we're having a garden festival in the autumn, all about gardening kind of sustainably. We have open gardens here at Yeo Valley, which are run organically. So whilst they're doing something a bit different to trying to feed the cows like we do on the farms, they work with lots of the same principles, composting, and that kind of thing. And yeah, so if anybody can't get on a farm to fridge day or a best of both day, they could perhaps get down to the garden festival, which is taking place on the farm, and see what's going on down
Or
there.
just down to the gardens if they can't make the festival.
Gardens are lovely. The gardens are open to the public, and you can get cake.
Say no more.
As if we weren't already fully on board. You mentioned cake. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a whistle-stop tour. I'm sure we could have chatted for much, much longer, but I feel like I know a lot more about dairy and regen agriculture and what organic actually looks like on British farms. So thank you so much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Thank you.